why do payday lenders exist? They exist because people need money between paychecks. And they exist for that reason, and they charge predatory fees. So why not innovate and come up with a solution which doesn't charge predatory fees like what we do?
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast, a show where we spotlight companies making money by making the world a better place. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and if you share a passion for using commerce to solve many of the world's most pressing problems, then this is the show for you. Imagine that you had less than $400 in your bank account right now. Well, if you're like half of all Americans, you don't need to imagine it since that's your reality. You're living paycheck to paycheck and have to carefully plan your spending during the 2 weeks you're waiting to get paid, since if you time things wrong, you're going to run out of cash and start paying bank overdraft fees. Enter predatory payday lenders who only exacerbate the problem for the working poor. Well, our guest on the 24th episode of Business for Good, a rocket scientist turned fintech entrepreneur, says there's no reason in the modern world people should have to wait 14 days to get paid for work they already did 2 weeks ago. It's their money, after all, Safwan Shah says, and they should have access to it on demand. And if they don't, the employer is essentially using the employee as a source of credit for itself and at zero interest, no less. In addition to founding his own payroll-type company to address this problem, which incidentally raised recently a $20 million Series B round, Safwan wrote a fascinating book on the topic that I read recently. The book is called It's About Time: How Businesses Can Save the World One Worker at a Time. And he joined us to talk about it. His company is now in business with the likes of major employers like Walmart and Uber, helping to fulfill what Safwan calls his life's mission: to use business to eliminate financial suffering of the neediest. Joining me again as my co-host this episode is my friend and economic mathlete, Joanna Bromley. In this episode, Safwan gives Joanna and me a history of why we have the 2-week pay period in the first place, and even gets biblical on us, citing the thoughts of both Moses and Muhammad. Yes, it turns out they both prescribe that employers pay employees for their labor right away. So, listen to Safwan drop some ancient and modern knowledge on using timely payroll to help the poorest among us, and let us know what you think. Safwan Shah, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Welcome, Safwan.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.
I really got a lot out of reading your book. I really appreciated it, and I learned a lot from it. But before we get into that, Safwan, I'm wondering if you can just share with folks a little bit about your background, your upbringing. You've had a lot of financial success in the U.S., but that's not how you started out. So tell us a little bit about your story of your upbringing in Pakistan and what that led to for you coming to the U.S.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think it's a rags to riches story. It's not that I was ever, on the street. But when you live in a different part of the world, the environment, the circumstances, the just general way of the world or shape of the world is different. So unfortunately, it's not a rags to riches story, which is sometimes very exciting.
At least it is a two riches story, though.
It is. I wouldn't say it that way, but it is more of a different world to a different world. And it's like observations more than anything else. So yes, I grew up in Pakistan. I lived in many cities of Pakistan. For a lot of people are now familiar with the name of the country because of recent events of the last 2 decades. So I lived in many cities, and I've named some of them in the book. And went and did my engineering over there in a city called Karachi, which is the largest city of the country. And I went to an engineering school, got my undergrad over there, and then eventually ended up in America almost 30 years ago, and arrived in University of Colorado at Boulder. So this is sort of the very beginning, and now it's been 30 years in the US. So much of what I do is in some ways shaped, colored, impacted but by what I have seen in my life growing up in a different part of the world.
Interesting. So, Safwan, I'm very curious. We were looking at your bio, and it said that you were a former rocket scientist and work with NASA. Is that correct?
It is accurate, but with the minor caveat. I was working for BioServe Space Technologies, which was a part of the aerospace engineering department where I got my doctorate. And BioServe was at a NASA Center for the Commercialization of Space. So I lived and breathed with many of my colleagues who dreamt of becoming rocket scientists. I actually didn't even know what it meant. I didn't have that, not having grown up in a US environment. Of course, it was extremely fascinating to me, but that wasn't the burning desire in me. And I was very impressed with everyone around me, because there is a path, there is a track you get on to become an astronaut or to be one of the scientists who used to go in the shuttle missions. So many of them were my colleagues and in my lab.
So let's talk about that area then, because obviously the financial services industry has been your passion for some time now. And you write a lot in the book about this one particular problem. And I was pretty stunned by this, because as someone who doesn't live paycheck to paycheck, but maybe it's not stunning for people who do, but you say that, or you cite research actually saying that half of the country of America lives on, or has less than $400 in the bank right now. And that even in 35 years, from basically 78 through 2013, worker pay in the US only increased by 10%, but it's actually gone down for the lower bottom half of earners. So before we get to one of the solutions that you're proposing, why don't you just tell us why you think that is? Why is it that half of people have less than $400 in the bank and earnings have actually gone down for the bottom half of earners in the last few decades?
So I think there is a bifurcation that took place somewhere 30, 40, 50, 40 years ago. And what do I mean by a bifurcation? I think as automation came in our world, in our lives, in its wake, it left a lot of carcasses. And when people who are, doing variety of different jobs, manual, etc., when those jobs dried up, I think it left, it kind of bifurcated. The people who had technical skills and so forth, they earn orders of magnitude more than those people who don't have those skills. And in the US, that bifurcation kind of amplified itself, because there is a certain element of, you look at the facts, all the programming jobs and things like that went to different parts of the world. And many of those jobs, and there was just not enough people in the US with those trained technical skills. So I think in this automation in its wake left this situation. Now we can look back in hindsight and say that job retraining or whatever could have been done at that time, but it wasn't. And a lot of people got left behind with skills that can't be monetized at a higher level of salary. And I think it's as simple as that. It's not that anyone came with an objective to create inequality in the society. I think these little things kind of added up to make it happen.
So we now have this massive inequality, and one of the solutions that you're proposing, which sounds kind of like a simple solution, basically pay people more frequently, is something that I had never really thought much about. But the whole thrust of your book, and indeed your company PayActiv, is allowing this. So why don't you just start from the basics? What's so bad with getting paid once per 2 weeks?
So there is a cost of waiting to get paid, and if you are living paycheck to paycheck, which means that your entire paycheck is all that you have, and by the end of the 2 weeks, it's going to go down to zero. So there's no shock absorber in your financial life anymore. If a little tiny thing happens, some kind of tiny financial shock comes your way, for instance, your car breaks down, or your back to school happens and your child needs something. Somebody gets sick. So if you have a $500,000-$600,000 unexpected expense that comes up, you're pretty much left rudderless. And that is how millions of people in the US live. Now, if you ask me why do they live like that, I don't think there's a simple answer to it. It is a given fact now. I mean, the 2018 Federal Reserve report actually came out this week. And there are more than 50 million people in the US with less than $400 that they can produce in an emergency. So with millions of people living paycheck to paycheck, a tiny financial shock can, put them off the edge in deep disaster. How do you live in those conditions, right? It's like living on a tightrope. So the first thing you have to do when you are in such a situation is to manage your finances in a very, very clever way. And that is, I think, what PayActiv or activating your pay is one step towards that direction. The way to perhaps simply say it is you're drowning. And the first thing you have to do, if somebody is drowning, what is the first thing you do? You give them a hand to stop the drowning. It's only after you've stopped the drowning, then the next step is to say, okay, I'm 50 yards from the shore, or I'm 20 feet from the end of the swimming pool, and I can go there and come out. So what PayActiv is doing is helping stop the drowning. And then it goes to the next step, that once you've kind of balanced your budget a little bit, now let's start building a next nest egg. So the whole set of things have to happen. And this is what PayActiv is attempting to do and seeing a lot of success doing it.
Just be curious, going back, Safwan, why do we have this 2-week policy in the first place? Where did that come from?
So my research in this, and I cover it in the book as well, is that it's a legacy of the kingdom and general era of the world, where there were kingdoms and generals, the army, military, in those days when it paid you when you basically, vanquished the enemy and you shared the spoils of war. So you got paid when the war was won. And if it was a kingdom, you got paid when royalty wanted to buy loyalty. In the period in between, you were, just given enough to survive. You were kind of given enough to survive. And that is why there is this word in English called jubilee. Jubilee means forgiveness of debt. And the queen or king would forgive debts to make people and subjects more loyal. So it is a historic artifact that this exists. And why it exists in modern payroll systems is for that reason itself. And you'd be even more surprised to know that in the US, this staggered batch payroll came around when IRS wanted to collect taxes more frequently and periodically. They didn't want to be paid taxes, every 3 months or every 62 days. They had to run the government. So they mandated that businesses will pay their employees in a certain, cadence, a frequency, like a batch process. And every time they paid their employees, the taxes to the government would be collected.
When did the IRS mandate that?
I think it was in the 30s.
And so is that the genesis then of like the modern 2-week batch system? Was that from the 1930s onward?
I think so. I believe somewhere in the about 120 years ago, or 100 to 120 years ago, it started being questioned as an area for improvement. And then as computerization and all those things came along, it became better and better.
So 2 weeks, though, was an improvement over what workers were getting before back then.
Yeah, so the way to look at it is that very early on, they were paid when let's say they were building railroad tracks. So the owner of the business, the contracting company, would pay the employees when he got paid. Or it's like in the world of farming, when you cut the crop and sell it, that's when people get paid. Until then, they just barely survive. And that is why in the US, there were this whole concept of a company store, where if you were building railroad tracks in some, faraway place, you would buy your shoes, your rations, your uniform from a company store. And the company store would stock whatever it needed to because you were so far away from home. And just keep you, clothed and ready to go in a mine or build a railroad or a bridge. But your actual salary was paid when the owner got paid by whoever was whether it was a government or someone else who had contracted him or her.
So, Safwan, in the book, you talk about the problems of withholding people's pay, basically saying that ADP is acting as a bank, right? That the employer is holding the employee's money without interest. And that for a lot of people, that's a really big deal. It's not just a fairness principle, though. I mean, you argue that there's actually a biblical background for doing this. So the IRS may have mandated frequent batch system payments in the 1930s, but a couple millennia earlier, you say that even Moses was talking about this. So what did Moses have to say? I don't remember seeing this on Mount Sinai and the tablets, but apparently he did say something about it, right?
Deuteronomy 24:15, pay them their wages before the sun sets because they are poor.
Why would Moses say this?
Because holding back money is an instrument of control. And what did Moses fight against? What did most of these, all the Abrahamic religions, it was always about the need of the time, right? That it was a system that, was flawed or needed to be improved. And this was an instrument of control. And this is the era of the pharaohs and so on.
So maybe instead of telling Pharaoh to let my people go, he could have just said, pay my people more frequently. That would have been maybe a different story then.
Yeah, and particularly if they are poor, right? And if you kind of unpack this argument, so these were probably very helpless people. And when does helplessness set in life? It is when you are paycheck to paycheck. A tiny little, incident can push you off the edge. So why do that?
And it's not only in Judaism, right? I mean, I think that you mentioned that in Islam, there's also some mandates on this topic as well.
Yeah. So given that, the Proverb 3:28 also talks about it. So whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam, in Islam, it's a statement which goes like this: pay them their wages before their sweat dries. So, again, the implication is that they are poor. And in Christianity, it is, before the sun sets, because they may go home and not have food to eat, but they would have worked for you. I often give an example which goes like this, and I'll just, share it with you that let's take a situation, our real world, the world we live in, and I'll ask you this question. How do you pay your landlord? You pay them in advance, right? Everyone pays their landlord in advance. We also pay our vendors upon delivery, or we have set terms with them that if we'll pay them 30 days or 60-day terms, then it's a different price. And when it comes to our customers, and imagine it's a Starbucks, the customer walks in, pays for the coffee, the money goes to the company, right? And it's paid instantly. However, the person who serves the coffee or the person working behind the counter, they have to wait 2 weeks to get paid. Everyone got paid except the worker.
So then how could you even this out? How often should employers be paying their employees?
I think it has to be flipped. So today, every employee, and I do the math in the book. So let's say there are 140 million people who work in the US, and let's say 100 million of them are living paycheck to paycheck, just for, ease of calculation. And let's say they're all paid $1,000 a week. So 100 million people, $1,000 a week. That means $100 billion a week are accruing towards the employer. It's owed to the employees, right? Because they've already put in the hours. In the second week, it's another $100 billion. So $200 billion every 2 weeks for 100 million workers is held by businesses. So why do we need to take a loan from the poorest employees?
That's a good question. But what about people who are salaried? Do you think that this applies to them as well?
Let's say if they're salaried, let's say they have a buffer, they have X $1,000 in the bank. So they don't necessarily need the money, right? They're not going to go upside down. But if someone can't buy food for his children or can't, deal with some emergency, however, he or she has earned hours sitting in a spreadsheet in some database, which can't be processed, and this person allowed to access their own money, because I'm not saying that pay people what it doesn't belong to them. This is not a loan. This is their belonging. So today, if I work, let's say I work for Nordstrom or some large company, and I get $15 an hour, and this is the 7th day of the 2-week pay cycle, and I need $60. Now, I've already done 1 week. I've worked 8 hours every day, so I've got maybe 100 hours done. And if I want $50, can I make time fungible? Can I get 5 hours of my pay? I've already done 100 hours. Can you give me 5 hours?
So, Safwan, let me press you on this, because I read the book with great interest, and I would love to know what the proper frequency you think should be. So obviously it would be best if it's instant, right? If you can just go on and get it. But let's say some employer isn't doing that. 1 week is better. I mean, there used to be a cost to paying employees. You had to print the checks and distribute them, but now that's not the case. So what would you prescribe if you're not doing an instant payment system? What actual frequency?
So I don't say a particular time. I think every person is different. All I say is it should be timely access to earned wages. If you earned it and you need it, you should be able to access it.
So tell us about PayActiv then, because you have started this company that you are now the CEO of, and I saw that you raised a $20 million Series B a few months ago. Congratulations. So let me just ask you, what does PayActiv enable? So if my company signs up to pay our employees via PayActiv, what does that mean for us?
So first of all, we only work with businesses. So it's a B2B company.
Yes, I'm saying if my company signs up with you guys to pay our employees that way, then what happens?
So we will approach the business, or the business approaches us, and we have to get connected to their time and attendance system. So we have access to all the hours that the employees have worked. Using those hours, we know what their pay rates are. Either the employer shares with us, or we'll assume a minimum wage for that place. So we know how many hours any person has worked, and we know what is that pay rate. And if it's overtime, double overtime, all that, all those rules and algorithms are there. So once we know how much somebody has earned at any point in time, we as a company then let that employee access a portion of the money that they've already earned. So our guardrail is half of what you've already earned. So if you've earned $400, you can access $200.
Why not $400?
Because there are taxes, there could be other deductions.
Okay.
And in some cases, there could be statutory. But that number is, of course, it's a rule. You can make it 70%. So many employers and other people may have some concerns or considerations.
So for the employers that you work with, how much of a paradigm shift is this for them? I mean, is this going to turn their accounting department upside down? Are there really huge shifts that need to be made, or is it relatively simple to?
The technological leap was that they have to do nothing. Mm-hmm. They have to pay nothing and they have to do nothing. So what we've done is we go to employers and there's no cost to set up or anything. We are already compliant with every time and attendance system in the country and every payroll system. And the monies, your question was that, their finance and accounting, how that changes. So the money that goes to their employee comes from PayActiv. We are the ones who give money first. And then we are reimbursed by the employer. We assume the 2-week cycle or the weekly cycle. And the employee can, in the between paycheck period, the employee accesses money from us.
So are you essentially giving the employer a loan in a way? So you're paying the employee?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Got it. That's very interesting.
To make this possible, I started this 7 years ago. And for 3-4 years, people scoffed, laughed. So it's impossible. And today they can't, it's like $300-400 million have been invested in this segment.
Can you give us some examples of some of the types of employers that you work with?
One of them is called Walmart.
Oh, wow.
And they are the largest in the world. So today, if any Walmart employee needs to access a portion of their earned wages, they come through an app which is by a different company. And let's say they want $200, they've already earned 500 or 400, some number thereof. They'll just press a button and money will be moved into their bank account. And we also have a relationship with Walmart that they can actually pick it up as cash in a Walmart store. Many people in America are entirely unbanked. They don't even have a bank account. And we also move it to any Visa, MasterCard. We also recently, Visa announced their partnership with us. We also work with Uber. Many people don't have the accounts in Uber because they don't have cards. They can't even use Uber. So let's say they have to get to work and they have no money for gas. They can, if they were using PayActiv, let's say they worked in Kentucky and they were in a, some factory or some nursing home or etc. They're caregivers, security guard, whatever. So they'll just go ahead. They can call Uber from our app.
A good friend of mine named Alfonso is an Uber driver. And he tells me that he can take out his money that he's owed pretty much any time, like every day if he wants to.
Every day. Yeah. He's a contractor, right? So what Uber has done is that you open a bank account in, I think, some particular bank. And if you want money of your tasks the same day, you can just load it to your card.
Yeah, sounds pretty cool. I'm going to have to tell him that I spoke with the man who made that possible for him. I'm sure he'll appreciate it when he listens to this episode of the podcast. Yeah,
and in the case of Uber, they probably use some other bank, and they're a closed loop. In the case of PayActiv, it's different.
You've got Walmart, you've got Uber. These are obviously some of the biggest names in employment. But you also write in the book, you had a really interesting line. I'm going to quote you here. You say that modern employers cling to the batch process with respect to their payroll practices with the fervor that a 15th century scribe might cling to his quill pen when offered a computer and keyboard. So why is it that some players like Uber and Walmart are willing to do this and others are still clinging to their quill pen?
It's changing. It's changing dramatically. It's one of those ideas which is so simple that most people get this head slapping moment that, oh, there must be something wrong in it. It's so obvious, and that why wouldn't it have been done before? Now we have 400, maybe 500, 450 businesses that use us. Several million people have access to this service. I don't think this question is there anymore. We crossed that threshold in the last, few years where employers questioned this, and these questions that, oh, if I give them money more frequently, or if I give them their paycheck a little early, they might not come back tomorrow. Another one is that this will hurt them even more because waiting to get paid somehow, in people's opinion, it builds character, and that is such a fallacious argument. Think about it. If I waited 36 hours before I ate, and then I ate a huge steak, how hard is it for you to tell me that, Safwan, that's wrong?
Easy for those who have more than 400 hours in the bank to talk about how others ought to be building the character by fasting.
Yes, so exactly. So why don't we make them wait for 6 months? So the question is that it's like common sense. If you need it and it's very high cost outside, right? Why do payday lenders exist? They exist because people need money between paychecks. And they exist for that reason, and they charge predatory fees. So why not innovate and come up with a solution which doesn't charge predatory fees like what we do?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, you mentioned that the whole idea that this builds character, but in your book, you argue that obviously paying people more quickly makes their lives easier, but it also helps them to become better employees and improves employee retention. I'd just be curious if you could expand upon that a little bit.
So there are three things that employers always aspire for as KPIs: retention, recruitment, and engagement, right? You want engaged employees, you want to retain them longer, and you want to recruit them easier. All three metrics are dramatically improved because, first of all, we are in a tight labor market right now. So if you ask someone to work for you and you say one of the benefits that is available is that you can access your pay as you earn it in a timely way. I do not subscribe to paying people every day. What I subscribe to, it should be on demand, because and so there various factors that go into it. So employers see these three benefits very directly. Retention improves close to 50% on the high end and 19% on the low end, depending on business employer segment. So when the study was done on our data about 2.5 years ago, and last year the researchers published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and it was done at Harvard Kennedy School. It was 18 months of data, and they put a number, something like $450 million in turnover improvement savings for a company like Walmart, annualized, about $30 million for Target. And what we're seeing repeatedly with our businesses adopt us for this reason, that it improves their retention. It improves morale. For the first time, the lower income employee feels that the employer is not lecturing them, but actually giving a benefit that benefits them. You can imagine the indignity on the employee side. The entire struggle is for dignity, for financial security, for an ability to get access to services. It's all about access, right? At the end of the day, can I access financial services? Uber for you and me is so easy. Uber for a $12 an hour worker who doesn't have money for gas, and if he or she doesn't get to work, won't make $100 in that day. It's a lifesaver, but they can't use Uber. Same with Amazon, right? You can't buy on Amazon if you don't have a card. You have to use Amazon Cash. Recently, we integrated Amazon Cash in our app.
Well, we really are grateful for what you're doing, Safwan. It is a really admirable company that you've started that can really help to improve the welfare of vast numbers of Americans and hopefully people around the world, as you, I'm sure, have eyes on expanding internationally as well. So thanks for writing such an important book. And we hope a lot of employers will listen to this and will perhaps change their practices as a result of it. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask you real briefly if there are any resources that you would recommend, obviously, aside from your book, or rather in addition to your book, for anybody who wants to learn more about this, anybody who's interested in finding out more about this topic. What would you recommend?
So, we have, sometimes you build a company which changes creates a category, and we did that. So we had to really lead by education. So words like earned wage access or between paychecks and all those things were coined by us. So one, maybe self-serving, but, all the insights and blogs and case studies that we've put out in the last 5-6 years, that's still very current and useful as data. Second thing is that, the whole, the history of payroll and finance in the US is very important to understand, because I firmly believe that every business is out there to do good. And businesses are looking for products that improve the lives of their employees and improve their customer service, improve their customer and marketing and all those capabilities. So I really think that in the US, anyone who's doing research on this, we should start thinking about building those products which improve the lives of people. It is very important. And that is a big mission of ours. And I would point anyone to go and think of ideas which improve something of mankind.
We definitely agree with that. So we usually like to close off the interview with a question. What are you grateful for?
Oh my God, so much. I think for finding this purpose, for being able to stumble upon this idea and to not give up when everyone said no. I'm very grateful to whatever circumstances caused me to do that. I guess in some ways, what I'm saying is I'm grateful to America for being there, and for people like me who've come here and went to school here and lived here, learned so much. So I guess in a strange, romantic sort of a way, I'm grateful to America for being this bastion of opportunity and hope.
Well, it's a great way to end the interview, Safwan. We really appreciate you coming on the show. We appreciate all your work, and we will be rooting for your success.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Safwan.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found use in this episode. If so, don't keep it to yourself. Please leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, we hope you will be in the business of doing good.